The border was 3 degrees off. Seth and Cal noticed it at the end of a routine calibration shift, the kind of shift that cartographers in the Tessarine Guild worked with half their attention, while the other half drifted to meal schedules and corridor gossip. She had been cross-referencing the sector null perimeter against the latest gravitational lens data from the outer beacon array, a standard maintenance check performed every 40 cycles, when a parallax line failed to resolve. She ran the calculation again. The line failed again. She adjusted for instrument drift, for signal degradation, for the 17 categories of minor error that the Guild's calibration manual listed as common sources of deviation. None of them accounted for it. The border of the Forbidden Sector, as drawn on every chart in the Guild's archive, sat 3 degrees spinward of where the gravitational data said it should be. Not a rounding error, not a sensor artifact. 3 full degrees, a wedge of space nearly a parsec wide at the sector's nearest point, expanding to several parsecs at its far edge. A region that the chart said was inside the forbidden zone, but that every verifiable gravitational signature indicated was ordinary, unclaimed, empty space. She pulled the master chart, the one the Guild maintained as its authoritative reference, the one every published navigation atlas in the Confederation was derived from. The border was drawn in the same place it had always been drawn. She pulled the previous edition. The same. The edition before that. The same. She went back 50 years, then 100, then 200, pulling archived master charts from the deep storage lattice until her console was buried in overlapping projections. Every single master chart, going back 412 years, drew the border in the same wrong place. Sethan sat back in her chair. The star chart room was empty except for her. The rest of the calibration team had logged out 2 hours ago. The only light came from her console and the vast projection of the master chart hovering above her workstation, the forbidden sector marked in the standard red exclusion overlay, the border line glowing faintly against the dark background of uncharted space. She stared at the line, 412 years. That was not an error. An error would have been caught in the first decade. An error would have been noticed by any of the thousands of cartographers who had worked this sector's border in the centuries since the restriction was imposed. An error would have been corrected during the great recalibration of the Tessarine archive 60 years ago, when every border in every chart had been verified against fresh survey data. Unless it had not been an error at all. Sethan closed her console, locked her workstation, and walked the long corridor from the calibration wing to her quarters without speaking to anyone. She did not file a discrepancy report. She did not flag the anomaly in the shift log. She lay in her bunk in the dark and thought about the one thing every Tessarine cartographer understood from their first day in the Guild. The charts were sacred. The Guild's authority rested on the absolute accuracy of its work. Every navigation atlas, every trade route, every military patrol corridor, every diplomatic boundary in the Confederation was derived from Tessarine master charts. The charts were never wrong. Except they were. They had been wrong for over 4 centuries, and the wrongness was too precise, too consistent, too carefully maintained to be anything other than deliberate. She went back the next morning and began pulling data she was not supposed to pull. The calibration archives were organized by sector, and the Forbidden Sector, formally designated Exclusion Region 7, informally called the Silence, the Void, the place that ate ships, or any of a dozen other names that varied by species, and by the degree of superstition the speaker carried, had its own restricted subsection. Sethan's clearance gave her access to the border coordinates and the gravitational reference data, but not to the underlying survey records that had established the border in the first place. Those records were marked with a classification tag she had never seen before, Foundation Lock. She had been a Tessarine cartographer for 23 years. She knew every classification level the Guild used. Foundation Lock was not one of them. She queried the Guild's classification index. The term did not appear. She searched the procedural manuals, the training archives, the administrative records going back to the Guild's founding charter. Nothing. Foundation lock existed only on the files themselves, a classification that classified its own existence. Sethin felt the first cold thread of something she could not name. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to vertigo, the sensation of standing on solid ground, and realizing the ground was thinner than she had assumed. She spent the next 3 days running quiet searches through every database she could access without triggering audit flags. She was careful. She varied her query patterns, spread her searches across different workstations, logged in and out at irregular intervals to avoid creating the kind of consistent access trail that the Guild's monitoring systems were designed to detect. She was not paranoid by nature, but the Foundation lock tag had introduced a new variable into her understanding of how the Guild operated, and she was adjusting accordingly. What she found was not much, but it was enough. The Forbidden Sector's border had been established 419 years ago, following what the Guild's official history called the Consolidation Survey, a comprehensive remapping of the galactic fringe, conducted jointly by the Tessarene Guild and the Confederation's Strategic Cartography Division. The survey had produced the definitive chart of the outer sectors, including the first formal demarcation of the Forbidden Zone. Before the Consolidation Survey, the Forbidden Sector had existed as an informal avoidance zone, a region that ships did not enter and navigators did not plot courses through, but that had no official boundary on any chart. The survey gave it one. The survey made it real. Sethin pulled the public record of the Consolidation Survey. It listed 42 survey vessels, 611 crew, and a mandate from the Confederation Council to establish permanent navigational boundaries for all territories of restricted access. The survey had taken 4 years. Its final report was 308 pages long. None of the 42 survey vessels had carried gravitational lens equipment. Sethin read that line 3 times. Gravitational lens surveying was the foundation of all precision cartography. It was how cartographers determined the exact position of sector boundaries, the gravitational center of star systems, the precise curvature of navigational corridors. Without gravitational lens data, a survey could produce approximate boundaries good enough for general navigation, perhaps, but not the kind of precision the Tessarene Guild staked its reputation on. Not the kind of precision that had been maintained, unchanged, for 419 years. The Consolidation Survey had drawn the Forbidden Sector's border without the instruments required to draw it accurately. And every master chart since then had preserved that inaccurate border without question. She needed to see the original survey data. The Foundation lock files were stored in the Guild's deep archive, a sealed section of the data lattice that occupied its own physical server cluster in the basement levels of the Tessarene Citadel. Sethin did not have access. No working cartographer did. The deep archive was administered by the Guild's continuity office, a small department that Sethin had always understood to be a records management bureau, the kind of bureaucratic appendage that every old institution accumulated. She had never had reason to interact with it. She had never met anyone who worked there. She looked up the continuity office in the Guild's personnel directory. It listed 4 names, 4 people managing the institutional memory of the largest cartographic organization in the Confederation. She cross-referenced the names against the Guild's operational records. None of them had published a cartographic work. None of them had served on a survey team. None of them had any listed qualification in cartography at all. The continuity office was not staffed by cartographers. It was staffed by administrators, bureaucrats whose job, as far as Sethin could determine, was to maintain the deep archive without understanding what was in it, or perhaps without being allowed to understand. She was running out of quiet avenues. Every path she followed led to the same locked door. The Foundation locked files in the deep archive, guarded by an office that existed to guard them and nothing else. She could file a formal access request, but that would put her name on a record, attached to questions about the Forbidden Sector's border, and she had developed an instinct growing sharper by the day that attaching her name to those questions was dangerous. Instead, she went to the one place cartographers went when the official records failed them, the Annex. The Annex was the Guild's informal archive, a warren of storage rooms on the Citadel's upper levels where retired cartographers had deposited personal notes, draft charts, working journals, and other materials that did not fit the formal archive's classification system. It was poorly organized, barely maintained, and technically open to any Guild member. Nobody went there. The Annex held nothing of official value. Sethin went there on a rest day, when the upper levels were empty. She spent 9 hours in the dust and the silence, working through storage crates that had not been opened in decades. Most of what she found was useless personal correspondence, draft calculations, equipment manifests, the accumulated detritus of careers spent measuring the distances between stars. But in the 4th hour, in a crate marked with the name Over and Selk, a cartographer who had died 71 years ago, she found a working journal that stopped her cold. Over and Selk had been assigned to the calibration division in the same decade that Sethin now worked in 23 years into a career that had been distinguished but unremarkable. His journal covered a period of 18 months, and it documented, in careful technical detail, the same discovery Sethin had made. The border was wrong. The gravitational data did not match the charts. The discrepancy was 3 degrees. He had found it 71 years ago. He had measured it with the same instruments Sethin used. He had arrived at the same conclusion. The error was deliberate. And then the journal stopped. The last entry was dated and timed. It read, "Called to the Continuity Office, Director Hesketh, tomorrow 800, the border question." There were no more entries. Sethin checked the Guild's personnel records. Over and Selk had been transferred from the calibration division to the Survey Extension Office, a remote posting on the Outer Rim, 2 days after that final journal entry. He had spent the remaining 38 years of his career at the farthest possible distance from the Tessarine Citadel, mapping dead systems that no one would ever visit. He had never returned to the calibration wing. He had never published again. Sethin put the journal back in the crate. Her hands were steady, but her breathing was not. She went deeper into the Annex. She was looking for a pattern now, and patterns, once you knew to look for them, were difficult to miss. Over the next 6 hours, she found 3 more. A set of notes by a cartographer named Dreschen Vo, dated 114 years ago, documenting the same 3-degree discrepancy and ending abruptly with a transfer to the Survey Extension Office. A partial draft report by a team of 2 Pellier Inth and Cor Sesson dated 160 years ago, analyzing the consolidation survey's methodology and flagging the absence of gravitational lens equipment, with both authors subsequently reassigned to remote postings within the same cycle. And a single page, undated and unsigned, written in a hand that trembled, that said only, "The border is wrong on purpose. They know. They have always known. I am told to stop asking. I am told I will understand why." 4 cartographers across 160 years had found what Sethin found. All 4 had been silenced. Not killed, the Guild was not that kind of institution, but removed, relocated, placed at distances where their questions could not reach the people who might listen. The border was not an error maintained through incompetence. It was a lie maintained through policy. Sethin left the Annex and went to her quarters. She sat on her bunk and looked at the wall and thought about what a 3-degree misplacement of the Forbidden Sector's border actually meant. The charts said the border was here. The gravitational data said it was there. The difference was a wedge-shaped region of space that the charts placed inside the Forbidden Zone, inside the area that no ship was permitted to enter, that no navigator would plot a course through, that the Confederation had declared off-limits since before any living species could remember why. But that wedge of space was not inside the forbidden zone. It was outside. It was ordinary space, unclaimed, uncharted, but ordinary. The forbidden sector was smaller than the charts said it was, which meant the Guild had been telling the galaxy that the forbidden zone was larger than it actually was. For over 400 years, the Tessarene Guild had inflated the restricted area by 3 degrees, expanding the border outward into space that had no reason to be restricted, and every species in the Confederation had obeyed that border without question because the charts said so, and the charts were never wrong. Why? The question sat in Sethin's chest like a stone. She was a cartographer. She mapped what was there. She drew lines where lines belonged. The idea that her guild, the institution she had given 23 years to, the institution whose founding principle was accuracy above all, had been deliberately falsifying its most important boundary for 4 centuries was not merely disturbing. It was foundational. If the forbidden sector's border was a lie, then every chart that included it was a lie. Every atlas derived from it was a lie. Every navigation calculation that rooted around the forbidden zone was based on a lie. And if the border was a lie, what else was? She thought about the forbidden sector itself, the restriction, the reason for it. Every species in the Confederation knew the broad strokes. The forbidden sector was where the humans were, or where the humans had been, or where something had happened involving humans that was so catastrophic, so absolute, so far beyond the scale of normal conflict that the galaxy had collectively agreed never to go there again. The specifics varied by species and by era. Some cultures remembered it as a war, others as a plague, others as something that defied categorization, but the consensus was universal. Do not enter. Do not approach. Do not ask. But if the border was drawn 3 degrees too wide, then the restriction was not just about keeping ships out of the danger zone. It was about keeping ships out of space that was not dangerous at all. Space that someone, 419 years ago, had decided to add to the forbidden area for reasons that had nothing to do with human space and everything to do with what? Sethin did not sleep that night. By morning she had made a decision. She filed a formal access request with the Continuity Office. She used her real name. She stated her purpose clearly: to review the original survey data from the Consolidation Survey, specifically the methodology used to establish the border of exclusion Region 7. She cited the gravitational lens discrepancy and the 3-degree deviation. She attached her calibration data. The response came in 4 hours. Not a denial, an invitation. Director Vesk of the Continuity Office would see her at her convenience. The Continuity Office occupied 3 rooms on the Citadel's lowest administrative level, a corridor that Sethin had walked past 1,000 times without ever entering. The door was unmarked. The interior was clean, quiet, and ordinary. A reception area, a small conference room, and a closed office behind it. Director Vesk was waiting in the conference room. She was older than anyone Sethin had met in the Guild. Her scales faded to the pale gray that Tessarene biology produced only in extreme age. Her eyes clear and patient, and completely unsurprised. "Sit down," Vesk said. "You are the 6th." Sethin sat, the 6th. The 6th cartographer to find the 3-degree discrepancy and follow it to this office. The first was Pellier Inth, 160 years ago. You are the latest. There will eventually be a 7th. You know about the discrepancy. I maintain the discrepancy. That is what the Continuity Office does. The words landed with a weight that Sethin felt in her bones. She had expected denial, deflection, bureaucratic obstruction. She had not expected a quiet old woman in a clean office telling her, without hesitation, that the lie was real and that she was its keeper. "Why?" Sethin asked. Vesk looked at her for a long time. Then she stood, walked to the closed office door, and opened it. Beyond the door was not an office. It was a stairwell descending into the substrate of the citadel, and at the bottom of the stairwell was a room that Sethin had not known existed. The room was circular, small, and dominated by a single display, a chart, not a Tessarene master chart. Something older, rendered in a projection format that Sethin did not recognize, using coordinate systems that predated the Guild's notation by centuries. "This is the original survey chart," Vesk said. "The one the Consolidation Survey actually produced, not the one they published." Sethin looked at the chart. The forbidden sector was there, marked in the same red exclusion overlay she saw every day on her workstation. But the border was different. It was 3 degrees tighter, exactly where the gravitational data said it should be. The chart was accurate. And inside the border, in the space that the accurate chart showed as part of the forbidden zone, but that the published charts had expanded to cover, there were markings, notations, small, precise, methodical entries in a script that Sethin recognized after a moment as Old Tessarene, the Guild's founding language, used before the standardization reforms 3 centuries ago. She leaned closer. The notations were survey readings. Sensor returns, gravitational signatures, spectral analyses. The Consolidation Survey had not merely drawn the border, it had surveyed what was beyond the border. The survey vessels had entered the forbidden sector. They had looked at what was inside. "Read them," Vesk said. Sethin read. The entries were technical, stripped of commentary, recorded in the flat clinical language of field cartography. Gravitational signatures consistent with planetary bodies, but with no corresponding stellar mass. Spectral returns indicating material composition, unlike any known element. Spatial geometry that did not conform to standard relativistic models. And repeated in 11 separate entries across 6 different survey vessels. A single observation that Sethin read 3 times before she understood it. Sector geometry is responsive. Border configuration changes in correlation with observation methodology. The sector is aware of being mapped. Sethin stepped back from the chart. The air in the underground room was cool and still, and tasted faintly of old metal. "The survey found that the forbidden sector responds to observation," Vesk said. Her voice was calm, instructional, the voice of someone who had delivered this briefing before. "When the survey vessels attempted to map the interior changed. Not randomly, deliberately. The sector adjusted its own geometry in response to the mapping methodology being used, as if it understood what cartography was, and was choosing what the cartographers would see." "That's not possible." "The survey data is in front of you. 42 vessels, 611 crew, 4 years of work. They all recorded the same thing. The forbidden sector is not a place that happens to be dangerous. It is a place that is aware. It knows when it is being observed. It knows when it is being measured, and it adjusts itself accordingly." Sethin's training rebelled against every word. Space did not have awareness. Sectors did not respond to observation. Geometry did not change because someone pointed a sensor at it. These were the foundational assumptions of her profession, and they were being contradicted by data recorded in her guild's own notation, by survey vessels operating under her guild's own authority. "The border," she said, her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "The 3 degrees." "Yes, the Consolidation Survey established the accurate border, the one on this chart. But the survey's commanding officer, a cartographer named Tessin Kor, made a decision. She determined that the accurate border was too close. If the sector was aware, if it could adjust its geometry in response to observation, then the precise location of its boundary was not a fixed fact, it was a relationship. The sector allowed itself to be observed up to a certain point. Beyond that point, it decided what you saw. And Tessin Kor concluded that a boundary defined by the sector's own willingness to be observed was not a safe boundary. It was a threshold. So she moved the border. She expanded it by 3 degrees. She added a buffer zone, a region of ordinary space that the charts would mark as forbidden, not because anything dangerous was there, but because she wanted to keep ships farther from the real boundary than the real boundary required. A margin of safety. And she classified the original survey data under a designation of her own invention, Foundation Lock, to ensure that no one would stumble across the accurate border and conclude that the published border was an error. And the Guild maintained it. For 419 years, every director of the Continuity Office has understood what the discrepancy is and why it exists. Every cartographer who has discovered it, there have been 6, including you, has been given the same briefing I am giving you now. And every one of them has been given the same choice. What choice? Whether to correct the charts or to leave them wrong. The question hung in the underground room. Sethin looked at the original survey chart, at the accurate border drawn 3 degrees tighter than the one the galaxy navigated by, at the notations that described a sector of space that watched its own cartographers and rearranged itself in response to their instruments. Every cartographer who has sat where you are sitting, Vesk continued, has understood the same thing. The 3-degree buffer is not a lie. It is a gift. Thesson Core gave the galaxy 3 extra degrees of distance from something that knows when you are looking at it. 3 degrees of space where ships can be wrong about their position, where navigators can drift slightly off course, where errors in calculation will not bring a vessel to the real threshold. The published border is inaccurate, but it is safer than the truth. And the 5 before me, Sethin said, they all chose to leave it. They all chose to leave it. Pellier Enth struggled with it for 3 months and then asked for a posting where she would not have to look at the border every day. Over and Selk asked the same. The others stayed, but they stopped calibrating the forbidden sector's boundary. They mapped other things. They built distinguished careers in other specializations, and they never spoke of it. Sethin stood in the cool, still room and felt the weight of 4 centuries of deliberate inaccuracy pressing against the instinct that had driven her entire career, the imperative to make the chart match the territory. The charts were wrong. She had proven it. She had traced the wrongness to its source. She had found the lie and identified the liars and uncovered the mechanism by which the lie had been preserved. And the lie was a kindness. She thought about the sector that responded to observation. She thought about a boundary defined not by geography but by willingness, the willingness of something vast and aware to let itself be observed up to a point and no further. She thought about Thesson Core, 419 years dead, standing in this room or one like it with fresh survey data that described the impossible and making the cartographer's hardest decision, to draw the line not where it was, but where it should be. How do you know it's still enough? Sethin asked. 3 degrees, that was Thesson Core's margin based on Thesson Core's data. How do you know the sector hasn't expanded? How do you know the real border hasn't shifted closer? Vesk was quiet for a moment. Then she walked to a secondary console set into the wall and activated it. A new display appeared, not a chart but a data stream, a continuous feed of gravitational readings from monitoring stations positioned along the published border of the forbidden sector. The data was live. It was being collected now, in real time, from instruments that Sethin had never known existed. The Continuity Office does not only maintain the discrepancy, Vesk said. We monitor the real border, continuously, since the day Thesson Core established this office. If the real border shifts, we know. If the 3-degree buffer shrinks, we adjust the published charts to maintain the margin. We have done this 7 times in 400 years. Small corrections. A fraction of a degree here, a tenth of a degree there. Always expanding the published border, never contracting it. The charts have changed. The charts have always changed. Slowly, carefully, invisibly. The navigators see a minor revision note in the update log, exclusion region 7, boundary refined per updated gravitational survey, and they adjust their courses without asking why. That is the system Thesson Core built. The lie adapts. The margin holds. Sethin looked at the live data stream. The gravitational readings were stable. The real border, the true threshold where ordinary space ended and the aware sector began, was sitting precisely where the monitoring station said it was, 3 degrees inside the published boundary, exactly where it had been when Sethin had first noticed the discrepancy on her calibration console. She thought about the unsigned page she had found in the annex. The border is wrong on purpose. They know. They have always known. I am told to stop asking. I am told I will understand why. She understood now. The unnamed cartographer who had written that page had understood too. The border was wrong, and the wrongness was the point, and every cartographer who learned the truth had carried it the same way. In silence, as a burden that looked like a lie but functioned as a shield. The 5 before me, Sethin said. They could have corrected the charts, published the accurate border, told the galaxy the truth. Yes. And the sector would have noticed. The survey data suggests it notices everything that happens at its boundary. It noticed 42 survey vessels 419 years ago. It noticed them so precisely that it adjusted its own geometry to control what they could map. If the published border contracted to the accurate line, if ships began navigating closer to the real threshold, it would notice that too. And we do not know what it would do. You don't know what it would do because no one has tested it. Thesson Core decided that testing it was not worth the cost. Every director since has agreed. The 3 degrees are not just a buffer for navigation errors. They are a buffer for ignorance. We do not know what the sector is. We do not know what the humans did or what the humans became or what lives in that space now. We know only that it is aware, that it watches its own boundary, and that for 419 years the expanded border has kept it and us at a distance that both sides appear to tolerate. The lie is the peace. Sethin felt something shift inside her, not the collapse of certainty, but the rearrangement of it. She was a cartographer. She drew what was there. But Thesson Core had been a cartographer too, and Thesson Core had looked at what was there and decided that what was there was too close. What happens to me now? Sethin asked. That depends on you. The 5 before you each chose their own path. Some left the calibration wing. Some stayed but stopped asking. One, the most recent, 11 years ago, asked to join the continuity office. She monitors the eastern quadrant now. And if I choose to correct the charts? Vesk's expression did not change. Then I will not stop you. The continuity office has no authority to override a guild cartographer's professional judgment. If you file a formal correction to the master chart, the guild's review board will evaluate it, and they will find that your data is accurate, and they will approve the correction, and the published border will contract by 3 degrees. The accurate border will become the official border. Ships will navigate closer. The monitoring stations will record whatever happens next, and the continuity office will still be here, watching. She paused. But I would ask you to consider something first. You found the discrepancy because you are good at your work. You followed it because you are honest. Those are the qualities that make a cartographer worth the title. But the galaxy does not need a more accurate chart of the forbidden sector's border. The galaxy needs the border to hold. It needs the line to stay where it is, not because the line is true, but because the line is far enough. Thesson Core understood that 4 centuries ago. Every cartographer who has sat in that chair has understood it since. Sethin looked at the original chart one last time. The accurate border, drawn by survey vessels that had watched a sector of space rearrange itself in response to their instruments. The foundation lock files that had preserved the truth, while the published charts preserved the lie. 4 centuries of institutional deception carried out by an office of 4 people in 3 rooms on the lowest level of the Citadel, answering to no one, accountable to nothing except the margin between the lie and the truth. She thought about the wedge of space, the 3 degrees of ordinary, empty, harmless space that the charts said was forbidden, and that no ship would ever enter because the charts said so. She thought about navigators adjusting courses around a border that was wider than it needed to be, adding travel time, burning fuel, routing through longer corridors, all because a cartographer 400 years ago had decided they should be farther from the thing that watched. And she thought about the thing that watched, the sector that adjusted its own geometry, the space that knew what cartography was, the boundary that was not a location but a relationship, the point at which something vast and patient allowed itself to be seen. 3 degrees of kindness, drawn by a dead woman's hand. Sethin stood. She looked at Director Vesk, whose pale scales and clear, patient eyes had seen this moment 5 times before, and would see it again after Sethin was gone. "I want to see the monitoring data," Sethin said. "All of it. The full 400-year record. I want to understand what the sector has done at the real border. I want to know what the 7 adjustments looked like when the margin shrank, what triggered the expansion, how the published charts were modified." Vesk studied her. "That is not the same as asking to correct the charts." "No, it is not." "Then I will show you everything." They spent the rest of the day in the underground room. Vesk opened files that Sethin had not known existed, not just the original survey data but 4 centuries of continuous observation, a record of the forbidden sector's behavior that no one outside the continuity office had ever seen. The sector was not static. It pulsed subtly on a cycle that did not correspond to any natural phenomenon. Its gravitational signature shifted in patterns that suggested not randomness, but thought, slow, vast, patient thought, the kind of thought that measured time in centuries and considered a 400-year buffer zone a recent development. The 7 adjustments were there in the record, each one a moment when the real border had crept slightly outward, the sector expanding its threshold by fractions of a degree, the continuity office responding by expanding the published border to maintain the margin. The pattern was clear. The sector was growing slowly, imperceptibly, the way a root grows through stone. Not aggressively, not invasively. Just the slow expansion of something that occupied space the way a thought occupied a mind, by filling it. And in the monitoring data, Sethin found something that none of the previous 5 cartographers had seen, because none of them had asked to see the full record. She found it in the readings from monitoring station Crev 7, positioned on the published border's spinward edge, at the exact point where the 3-degree discrepancy was widest. The station had been recording gravitational returns from the real border for 311 years. For 309 of those years, the returns had been consistent with the rest of the network, stable, cyclic, the slow pulse of the aware sector doing whatever it did in the dark. But 2 years ago, the returns from Crev 7 had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would trigger an alert in the continuity office's monitoring systems, which were calibrated to detect the kind of fractional degree border shifts that had occurred 7 times before. The change was subtler than that. The gravitational signature from the sector's real boundary, as seen from Crev 7, had developed a modulation, a faint, regular variation superimposed on the sector's normal pulse. The modulation was precise. It was rhythmic. And it was directional. It was pointed at Crev 7. Sethin showed the data to Vesk. The old director looked at it for a long time. Her expression did not change, but her scales shifted color, a faint deepening of gray that, in Tessarine physiology, indicated the activation of stress hormones. "How long has this been in the record?" Vesk asked. 2 years. It started 26 months ago. And no alert was generated. The modulation is below the threshold for border shift detection. Your systems are looking for the boundary moving. This is not the boundary moving. This is something at the boundary, signaling. Vesk was quiet. The underground room was very still. "Signaling what?" Vesk asked. Sethin pulled up the modulation pattern and isolated it from the background pulse. She ran it through every classification algorithm in the Guild's analytical toolkit. None of them returned a match. The pattern was not gravitational noise, not stellar oscillation, not tidal resonance, not any of the 237 known categories of natural spatial variation. It was structured, it was intentional, and it was new. "I don't know what it's signaling," Sethin said, "but I can tell you one thing. The modulations period matches the calibration cycle of our gravitational lens array. Exactly. Whatever is producing this signal knows the timing of our instruments. It is signaling in rhythm with our own observation schedule." The room was silent. "It knows we are watching," Vesk said. "It has always known. You said that yourself. The survey data from 400 years ago established that the sector is aware of observation, but this is different. The survey showed the sector responding to observation, adjusting, controlling what was seen. This signal is not a response. It is an initiation. Something at the real border is not adjusting to our instruments. It is using our instruments' rhythm to send us a message." "What message?" "I don't know, but I know what the 3-degree buffer was designed to prevent. It was designed to prevent contact, to keep the galaxy far enough from the real border that the sector's awareness would remain a passive fact, something that watched but did not reach. Thesson Core's margin was not just distance, it was silence. The buffer kept us outside the range at which the sector would consider us worth engaging." She looked at the modulation data, the faint rhythmic pulse aimed at a monitoring station that had been quietly recording for 3 centuries. "And now something is engaging, not at the published border, not at the navigated distance, at the monitoring station, at the real distance, the one the charts do not show." Vesk sat down. She was old, and the weight of 4 centuries of careful lies was suddenly heavier than it had been that morning. "The buffer held for 419 years, Sethin said, "but the sector has been growing. 7 adjustments. 7 times the real border moved outward and the published border followed. And now, for the first time, something at the real border is not just expanding. It is reaching." "What do you recommend?" The question came from the director of the continuity office to a calibration cartographer who had walked into this building 6 hours ago, not knowing that the office existed. Sethin heard the weight behind it. Not bureaucratic deference. Trust. The same trust that Thesson Core had placed in the institution. She built the trust that the next cartographer to sit in this chair would be the kind of person who could look at the truth and decide what to do with it. "Expand the buffer," Sethin said. "Move the published border not 3 degrees 5, maybe 7. Give us the margin that Thesson Core gave us, but larger, because whatever is at the real border is no longer content to be watched. It is watching back. The review board will ask why. Tell them the gravitational survey detected a minor shift. Tell them the same thing you have told them 7 times before. They will approve the correction, and the navigators will adjust their courses, and the galaxy will keep its distance from something it does not understand." "And the signal?" Sethin looked at the modulation pattern one last time. A rhythmic pulse aimed at a listening post, timed to the cadence of instruments it should not know about, coming from a boundary it should not be aware of, sent by something that the galaxy had spent 4 centuries pretending was merely dangerous when the truth was that it was something the galaxy had no category for. "Leave the signal in the record," Sethin said. "When the 7th cartographer finds the discrepancy, and there will be a 7th, they will need to know that the margin is not just about distance. It is about time. Thesson Core bought the galaxy 4 centuries of silence. Whatever is in that sector, it spent 4 centuries listening before it decided to speak. The next buffer needs to buy us longer." Vesk nodded. She did not ask whether Sethin wanted to join the continuity office. She did not need to. She could see it in the way Sethin looked at the monitoring data. in the way her hands moved across the console with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 23 years reading the language of space and had just discovered that the most important chart she would ever work on was one the galaxy would never see. Sethin filed the border expansion the next morning. She cited updated gravitational survey data. The review board approved it in 3 days. The published border of exclusion Region 7 expanded by 4.7 degrees, the largest single adjustment in the Guild's history, buried in a revision note that read, "Boundary refined per updated gravitational survey. Navigational corridors updated accordingly." Navigators across the Confederation adjusted their courses. Trade routes bent slightly wider around the forbidden sector. Military patrols maintained a greater distance from the exclusion boundary. No one asked why. The charts were never wrong. 3 months later, the modulation signal from Crev 7 stopped. The gravitational returns from the real border settled back into their slow, patient pulse, the same pulse the monitoring stations had recorded for centuries. Whatever had been signaling had stopped. Sethin did not know whether the signal had stopped because the expanded buffer had moved the monitoring station beyond the range of engagement, or because the thing at the real border had received whatever response it was looking for in the silence, or because it had simply chosen to wait. She did not know, and she did not need to know. She was the 6th cartographer to find the lie and the first to make the lie larger. She worked in 3 rooms on the lowest level of the Tessarine Citadel, in an office that did not appear in the Guild's directory, maintaining charts that the galaxy would never see, monitoring a border that the galaxy did not know existed. The charts were wrong. They had always been wrong, and every morning Seth and Cal went to work to make sure they stayed that way.